Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. Now, for those of you that have been subscribed to my channel for a little while, or have just watched any of my regular content, you'll know that I am a huge fan of professional wrestling. My first ever retro review was of WWE 2K16. My first top 10 list was the top 10 WWE games that you need to play. So, as much as being a big fan of professional wrestling, I'm also a big fan of professional wrestling games. Hell, I'm even doing a MyGM mode stream right as we speak. But what would it look like if a wrestling game was mixed with something like Mortal Kombat? Well, as crazy as that sounds, we got just that with 1995's WWF Wrestlemania. And right now, we're going to do a retro review of this surreal and bizarre game. So from the start, we should clarify a few things. First of all, this game is generally known as WrestleMania the arcade game, despite all the promotional material I found just calling it WrestleMania. I'm going to specifically as well be looking at the SNES version, which is the one I played, in which only 6 available characters are there, as opposed to the 8 available on consoles such as the Genesis and the arcade itself. I suppose the first thing we should say is, this really isn't a wrestling game. It probably looks like it at first glance while you're watching the animations. However, if you watch more carefully, you'll see that it really isn't. For a start, as much as wrestling itself is a very flamboyant and over-the-top performance rather than any real fight, this game goes into such a cartoonish manner that it takes it to a whole other level. When you hit characters, things like gravity don't apply to any degree. They'll go flying through the air, and they'll even bleed out little animations, such as hearts for Bret the Hitman Hart, or bats for The Undertaker. It's kind of ridiculous in a fun and entertaining way. Whilst some of the moves that the wrestlers use do look like wrestling moves, others are ridiculous over-the-top cartoonish animations, such as bits of steel coming out of Lex Luger's arms, in reference to a steel plate that the character actually had in one of his forearms. While the overall animation, as we stated, is cartoonish and over the top, the actual wrestlers themselves look far more photorealistic than they ever had before, and this has to be commended. It's clear that games such as Mortal Kombat have heavily inspired this from how they've motion captured the wrestlers themselves. But again, this is where the game veers away from professional wrestling. In no way do you actually win the matches in the same way you would win a wrestling match. Whilst it looks at times as if the wrestlers are going for a pinfall, they only do this when the match is already won. In other words, you've beaten up all their energy, same as you would in a game like Mortal Kombat. So the pin itself is mainly just a facade. So how was such a bizarre wrestling game received back in 1995? Well, as is often the case with games like wrestling, it got very mixed reviews. Scores between 5 out of 10 and as high as 85% were not uncommon. But why were the scores so varied? Well, you might think that wrestling fans would be the ones to love it more, but in this case, it was actually quite the opposite. Very casual wrestling fans usually enjoyed this quite a lot. They got to see some of their favourite characters in a very easy to pick up and play arcade style game. But anyone who wasn't a fan of wrestling would have found this very low rate compared to something like Mortal Kombat, and anyone who was a proper hardcore wrestling fan would find it a little bit ridiculous. After all, I don't even get to play it in the same way I would a wrestling game, so it's not hard to see why its style of game garnered such varied scores. And the question then becomes, how does it stand up now? Well, the reality is, it's probably going to depend on the exact same things the retro score depended on. As a proper wrestling fan, I don't really enjoy this game. I can see why it's good cartoonish fun. I can see why the animation style is really good, especially given that retro feel. But for someone like me who wants to win a wrestling match by, I don't know, actually pinning or submitting my opponents, this game hasn't aged very well at all. Unfortunately, the SNES got the very worst version of a very niche game, and I think a 4 out of 10 is about as good as it gets. Thanks for watching. Please drop any opinions in the comments, and feel free to give us a like and subscribe.